there, I am Brenda and welcome to my kitchen. So today I'm going to make my spin on a French onion soup. So you know how French onion soup traditionally is very dark, beefy broth. The onions get caramelized down to a dark brown mahogany color. Well, this version is a much lighter take on it. Not lighter calorie-wise, but lighter in flavor. Because I like to use chicken broth and I don't like to caramelize the onions to that dark brown color. I like to get them all melted and buttery. So this version is a much lighter flavor, butterier flavor, but just as rich and delicious. So the ingredients I have all in front of me here. So starting of course with onions, and I'm going to be slicing up one more onion. I also have of course chicken broth, butter, some flour, salt, pepper. I've got a bay leaf and fresh nutmeg that I'm going to grate in there. And I'm going to use a sweet sherry. You can really use whatever wine or spirit of your choice, or you can leave it out altogether. That is really completely optional. It's up to you. And I'm going to use some baguette. So yeah, let's get started. Okay, for starters, let's talk about slicing onions. One of the biggest complaints people have about onions is, of course, that they make you cry. And I think that the biggest reason that people cry when they slice onions is because their knife isn't sharp enough. So I always like to start with a really nice sharp knife. If you don't have a sharpening steel, it's a good investment. You just want to run your knife across the steel, and you notice how I'm running it towards myself. And it doesn't take a lot, just 5 or 6, and that's good enough to make your knife really nice and sharp. And you'll notice that as soon as I cut my onion, I don't really have to exert any kind of pressure. It just goes right through. Peeling an onion, I like to cut the ends off first, and then the outer shell just kind of pops right off, really easy. Rather than trying to keep the whole thing as a big ball and then peel it. I don't know why people do that, because it's just cutting it up anyway. That just doesn't make sense. So let's just be quick and efficient. So there, my onion is cut up. Let me just get rid of my peels. Okay, you can of course slice your onion all sorts of ways. A lot of people like to cut it across the rings. I like to cut it lengthwise along the rings. I find that just holds the integrity of the slices of onion a little bit better. And you can see 0 tears, goes really easily. Again, the more pressure that you have to push when you're slicing the onion, the more those sulfuric acids and juices pop into the air, and that's what makes you cry. So you want to avoid that whenever possible with nice sharp knife. All right, let's just do the other half here. Okay, get that all into a bowl. And we're ready to start sauteing. Okay, so now we are going to saute our onions. So I'm just turning on the heat. I'm going to put it on about medium. Don't want it super hot. I like to use a nice big heavy cast iron pot. Whenever you're making soup, you want something that's just going to cook slowly and evenly. So I'm just going to let that thing go. And we're going to start with some butter. And I'm using about half a stick of butter. Don't freak out, I know it sounds like a lot, but you're making a whole pot of soup here, so let that start melting. And as it's melting, you can even put in your onions right away. It'll all start cooking together. Because it's not high heat, I'm not worried about, scorching my onions or anything. I'm going to keep it low and slow. Just let that start doing its thing. You can also add your salt and pepper right off the bat. That helps to keep it from getting too brown. Don't add too much salt, because obviously you can always add more later, but you can't take it out. And especially depending on what kind of broth you're going to be using. If your broth is already heavily salted, you certainly don't want too much salt in there. Okay, so we're just gonna let that start cooking, and we'll come back to it in a few minutes. So the onions have been sauteing now for just a little over 10 minutes, and you can see how they are melting away. They're just becoming translucent, and I don't want them, like I said, brown. This isn't going to be that dark brown onion soup that you're more familiar with. This is going to be more of a blonde version of that. So at this point, I like to add some flour, and the flour is just to add a little bit of body to the soup as it simmers away, because otherwise it's just really brothy and very, liquid. This just adds a little bit of, like I said, I think body to it, makes it just a slight thicker consistency. So you just want to slightly toast that flour, make sure it's all mixed in and everything's all coated with it. And I'm going to deglaze the pan with some sherry. Now I mentioned I'm using a slightly sweet sherry. You can certainly go with something that's a little bit drier, or just plain old white wine. You could use brandy. And the idea there is it just adds an extra complexity to the flavor of the sauce, of the soup, pardon me. And people will taste it. They won't taste the alcohol, but there's just going to be that extra little flavor that you're trying to figure out, well, what is that? So once the sherry has evaporated off, and you can see that it's just helping me kind of scrape up anything off, any of the flour residue off the bottom of the pot. Now I am going to add my broth. I like to use a low sodium broth. You can certainly use whatever your preferred broth is, and at this point you can also turn up the heat because you're going to want to get it all cooking. Don't add it all at once. Do a little bit so that you can really sort of mix in that flour into the soup base so that it's not lumpy. And as it comes together, you can see it thickens, and then you just keep adding more and more broth. There's no measuring here. This is however much you think you'll want to make the soup. Depends how many people you're serving. I'm actually, we're just going to be making it for 2, but this is going to be probably more like enough for 4 people, just because you're making a pot of soup, right? You might as well make it for 4 instead of for 2, and then you have leftovers, and that's always wonderful. So I'm going to add a little bit more. That box had already been started, so I'm just opening up a little bit more. And we'll let that come to a boil, and we'll see how that feels in terms of complexity and depth and everything else. Other seasonings that I like to add is 1 bay leaf. Bay leaf just is another one of those ingredients that adds so much to a soup. Doesn't take a lot. And then I like to add some nutmeg. So you can buy grated nutmeg already. I like to buy the whole nutmeg. That way, because I don't use it that often, it always stays fresh in my cupboard. So I just like to grate it when I need it, and then I have a nice fresh knob of nutmeg anytime. And that's just, I don't know, 10 grates or however you want to measure that. Okay, so let's let that keep going. And you're going to let this basically come to a boil, then you're going to turn it down and just let it simmer for, I don't know, an hour, however much time you got, however much time you need. This is one of those things where it's a very, very simple soup. Doesn't have a lot of complex flavors and ingredients, so you really just want onion, chicken broth. Needs a little bit more salt. Again, don't add too much because it is going to, some of it's going to evaporate, so you don't want it to over reduce and then be so salty that you're going to have to add more liquid again to counter out that salt. So let it, as soon as it comes to a boil, I'm going to turn it down, Just put it on the back burner for about an hour. So some time has passed. My soup, I think, is ready. So I'm just going to bring it over here where you can see next steps. All right. Gotta taste it. It's probably going to need a little zhuzhing up. And this is where you can put your own personal flair on it. So I'm just taking out that bay leaf. Nobody wants to eat that. And let's just check. Okay, that is yummy, but it needs a couple little finishing touches. So I'm gonna add a little bit more salt, a little bit more ground pepper, and I think it needs a little acid. And I was anticipating that it might. So I've got some rice wine vinegar. Again, this is where it's your own personal touch. So if you don't want vinegar, you might want lemon juice. You might want, maybe you don't need any kind of acid to it at all. Personal taste. I'm also going to add a little bit of, just a tiny dash of hot sauce. This is a secret that my aunt, who is a fantastic cook, when she first taught me how to make this soup, that was her secret ingredient. It took forever to get that out of her, to tell me what did she put in the soup, because I knew there was just that something. So now, let's just stir that up again. And I'm not adding enough hot sauce that it's like hot. I don't want it to be a spicy soup, but it just adds that extra interesting dimension. So now. Yeah, I think that's awesome. All right, so of course you're going to want oven-proof soup bowls. If you don't have onion soup bowls, you could use like a big coffee mug. You know, that always works, as long as it's a nice heavy ceramic that you can put in the oven and not worry about it. Also going to turn on my broiler, because the last part of a French onion soup is of course the melted cheese on top. So we're just going to ladle the soup into the bowls. And of course my ladle is bigger than my bowl. I'll make 2 of them. Like I said, I kind of made probably enough for 4. No biggie. I'll just put the rest in the fridge and have it tomorrow. Okay, and of course you want to leave room, because you need to put some croutons and cheese on top. So I'm just going to grab my oven mitts, because my pot is a little hot. Just to move it out of my way. Okay, now the croutons. A lot of people will just put like a slice of French bread or baguette on top. I find anybody who's ever eaten French onion soup, you know what the first thing you do? You dig in your spoon and you got this raft on top and you can't break through it. It makes it just impossible to eat, so you're getting there with your knife and you're trying to break it up. Well, do that ahead of time. Cut up the bread, and I also just toast it lightly in the oven so it's not soft and squishy. It's just a little bit drier like a crouton. And just kind of float them on top of the soup. They're not going to sink. They'll eventually sink if you ignore it, but you're not going to let it sit that long. So put the little raft on top. And this is Gruyere cheese, which is the classic cheese used for French onion soup. You could also, if you want something with milder flavor, you could use mozzarella, you could use Havarti, Fontina if you want a little more of an Italian flair to it. And then these go onto a sheet pan under the broiler until the cheese is nice and melty. So let's just put that into the oven. And that only takes, I don't know, 5 minutes or so. You just want the cheese melted, maybe turning a little bit brown on top. All right, we're back. The soup is out of the oven. I just got to show you how beautiful and yummy this looks. Get a load of that. It is gorgeous, and of course it's screaming hot out of the oven, so be very careful when you are serving it to your guests, and always make sure you give them a warning so people don't burn their hands as soon as they pick up the pot. You can also let it cool down a little bit, but I just got to dig in and just show you how lovely and rich that is. And you can see the little, I don't know if you can see the pull of the cheese, but oh, that's hot, but it is so good. I can't wait to dig in. Gotta let it cool though, or I am not gonna be able to talk because I'll burn my mouth. Anyway, I am Brenda. Thank you for joining me. Have a great day.